It goes without saying that Jax has harmed a whole lot of people, everyone he's ever coexisted with in fact. And while the ones he's wronged most are usually those who got too close and subsequently got burned, there is one person he actively targeted despite her seemingly wanting nothing to do with him. If you clicked on this video, you'll of course know that the person in question here is none other than Gangle. But before we really get into it, I want to quickly address the opinion that Jax is simply an asshole and not that bad, an opinion that I vehemently disagree with, although I do see how this conclusion can be drawn, and I don't want to shame anyone for thinking the actions of a cartoon character aren't that bad. A lot of what Jax does is simply being cruel with his words, and the so-called violence he engages in can look rather silly. In fact, nothing he does throughout the course of the show gets as realistically severe as the version of himself that strangled Pomni in his mind, and even with the additional context of driving Ribbit and Kothmo to suicide, or at least the allegorical equivalent of suicide, it's hard to argue targeted isolation and taunting alone are enough to label him truly evil, especially when his intent was to drive them away, not to victimize them per se. Having them commit suicide is clearly not what he wanted, regardless of the fact he's clearly responsible. However, what you need to keep in mind is that these people are forced to live in the vicinity of Jax, and while in some cases his intent was to shield himself from others, there are times he clearly sought out other members of the circus simply to mess with them for his amusement. And when you're deliberately inflicting pain on multiple people every single day, people who can't escape and are afraid of what you're going to do next, does the bullying not cross from dickishness into perverse harassment? But if you're not yet convinced, don't worry, because today we're going to be learning how Gangle proves Jax is a bad person, how it led to the Zooble funeral scene, but also why said scene shouldn't be taken too literally, because a lot of people are assuming it represents his true feelings, which is simply not the case, although it may seem like it if you take into account the behaviour that I'm going to be describing here. No one deserves to be bullied, but least of all, those who are so vulnerable that they can't even defend themselves. Gangle, of course, is the most vulnerable person in the entire circus. Before Zooble, Gangle had absolutely no self-esteem, actively hated herself, and had no will to protect her own agency whatsoever. These are all things Jax took advantage of to the fullest extent, manipulating and exploiting her in a myriad of different ways throughout the show. Even as early as the first episode, Jax was pretty nasty to Gangle, albeit in milder ways than later on. Here we see him delegate a role to her that she clearly isn't particularly mentally equipped to handle, a fact he sarcastically mocks. And later on, when Kothmo's abstraction is on the loose, instead of simply telling Gangle and Kinga they need to run, he physically moves them in a way that inflicts pain on them for his amusement. So okay, yeah, this is obviously very cartoony violence, and slapstick, especially in a digital world, is practically impossible to equate to real world violence. But you don't need a one-to-one equivalent to understand that this is very distressing for Gangle, and that it at least causes the digital sensation of pain. And if the experience is real to her, I'd argue the semantics of whether it's real or not to us doesn't really matter, especially when the show would later go on to dismantle Jax's nothing is real bullshit. And if the question is if that reflects on him poorly, the answer is of course yes, and those aren't the only telling moments in the episode. While Kinga and Gangle almost receive the exact same abuse here, Jax actually does target Gangle specifically in the episode's final moments.
Ladies first. No, wait, why would I say that?
This too may seem like a minor offense, but it too should be unpacked. So what does it actually tell us? That he's cruel enough to set someone up before knocking them down, sure, but we need to dig much deeper. Due to the now explicit context that Jax struggles to express his femininity, due to his hang-ups about being vulnerable, and seemingly having a toxic idea of masculinity instilled in him by his mother that he would of course attempt to emulate, transgressions that were implicitly misogynistic suddenly become much more overtly pointed. However, not even the misogyny is actually the point here. The point here is that Jax is projecting a deep-seated insecurity onto Gangle, and this would only be the start of how this plays into their relationship. However, let's put a pin in that and talk about episode 2, which highlights the specific uniqueness of Jax's abuse towards Gangle. Here, he once again coerces her into doing things she doesn't want to do. However, this time, he's much less comical about it. He gets really angry at Gangle, threatening to expose secrets about her sexual habits.
Or I'll tell Ragatha about the figurine thing.
Once again, what he does here might not look too bad on paper. This is, after all, something friends may tease each other about, but it's not the severity of the act per se, but rather the context of Jax inflicting deliberate emotional distress, leveraging something private and sensitive to get her to do something that goes against her moral code. This isn't the same as joking with your friend about their weird fetish. Gangle is not Jax's friend, and this is clearly violating a boundary. But if you need explicit proof he's taking advantage of her, you need look no further than the very same episode, where he gets angry at her for not being quote-unquote submissive and agreeable as she usually is. And in episode 4, we see exactly how Jax would deal with her not being so. So while I do believe he didn't intend to break Gangle's mask at the start, he's still pretty gross to her in another way, actively discouraging her from throwing a baseball. Now, you might be wondering why this is such a cruel thing, and once again, it's not the severity of the act, but the implications. It goes to show that he doesn't want her to be able to succeed at anything, not even something as simple as throwing a ball. I can think of a handful of reasons why he'd be doing this. The first is that his mother may have put him down in similar ways, maybe even in the specific context of throwing a ball, and he's simply passing on the trauma. Perhaps a stronger reason though is that he's scared that if he lets her succeed, even in something as small as this, he won't be able to push her around anymore. Which takes us to the rest of the episode. You might expect Jax to completely ignore Gangle's orders and to derail her managerial experience, and while that's the case initially, we later on observe something much more interesting. He's scared of her, and although it takes training, he ends up almost fully complying with her orders, proving that if Gangle was more assertive, Jax simply wouldn't bother with her. Most significantly, Jax explicitly states he prefers Gangle when she's sad, which is pretty messed up, no? Now, to be clear, Gangle is extremely annoying in this episode. This is a fact that even an intoxicated Ragatha calls out, albeit unintentionally. But the wording is key here. Jax doesn't want her to stop being bossy, he wants her to be sad. What reason could there be for this, other than the fact her sadness makes her amusing and easier to manipulate? Well, as it turns out, there just may be another one. With no Gangle around, Jax doesn't know what to do with himself, spending the entire episode bored and depressed. Partially, this is of course because he has no one to milk for amusement, and also because the adventure far too closely emulates real life. But at the same time, I think Jax is genuinely lonely here, hopping from person to person in search of conversation. At this point, obviously, he had no real friends, and with everyone being too preoccupied to acknowledge him, he's left all alone. He's so desperate for someone to chat to, in fact, he resorts to opening up to Pomni for interaction, something he never does, for reasons we're all now too aware of. This, of course, being the beginning of their friendship. But what exactly does that have to do with Gangle? Well, I think that she might have played another role for Jax, other than needing someone to exploit and project his issues onto. Gangle might be Jax's substitute for a real friend, further explaining why Jax is compelled to keep her from being happy and confident. And episode 5 nicely backs this speculation up in many ways. When the gang finally gets a moment to relax, Jax once again opens up to Pomni, asking her very sincerely if she thinks that Gangle is capable of being happy, specifically if it can come about simply by hanging around Zubul. I posited as such in a previous Jax video, but after episode 9 and with everything we've been over thus far, it's clear that this is Jax projecting. You see, Gangle is everything that Jax has forced himself not to be, but who he is deep down. Soft, emotional, and timid. Feminine. He's been led to believe these traits are weak and pathetic, very likely by his mother. But moreover, he thinks someone emblematic of such weakness could never be, and doesn't deserve to be, happy. So when he's asking whether or not Gangle can truly be happy, who he's really asking for is himself. At the same time, his attitude towards the prospect seems rather resentful, likely over the fact that she gets to be herself and he can't. A few seconds after that scene, Jax makes the claim that Gangle likes it when he's mean to her, as a defense to Ragatha's claim that she's hanging with Zubul to avoid his bullying, before backtracking and saying he doesn't care what anyone thinks. In isolation, I wouldn't take the claim that he thinks she likes it seriously, but because he got defensive about it, it seemed pretty sincere. So why would Jax claim to believe this? As far as the audience is aware, nothing Gangle has said or done would suggest this is the case. In fact, it's made rather clear she hates it. This is where that previously mentioned friend substitute theory comes into play. It's very possible that Jax wants to believe what they have going on is simple banter between friends, and he wants to believe she reciprocates those feelings. Now this is contradicted by the fact that in the last episode, and just a few moments prior, Jax is aware that she is in a constant state of sadness. Moreover, in episode 2, he even exploits this fact. But to that, I'd say he can still very much know the truth deep down, while deluding himself to make him feel better, a coping mechanism Jax is shown to be no stranger to in episode 6. Here it's revealed that every time the characters pair up, Jax always forces Gangle to be with him, to me really reinforcing the idea that he sees her as some sort of friend. However, this time, something very disturbing happens, at least for Jax. Gangle actually refuses. This is pretty much every fear that Jax had about Gangle coming true. He's losing the only person he could force to keep him company, and the punching bag he uses to vent his trauma. At first, he doesn't even let her make this decision, once again violating her boundaries and taking away her agency. This should make it clear it's abusive to anyone, but it's the next scene that goes even further. Although at this point, Zubul had helped Gangle come into her own, apparently enough for her to want to go nuts with a Tommy gun, she's still deeply afraid of Jax. She worries that the mere act of defying him will mean he's going to get painful revenge, and she has every reason to believe this to be the case. The fact she lives in dreaded fear of his physical abuse to this degree completely exemplifies just how unrelentingly torturous the relationship has been for her. I mean, Zubul tells her that she isn't Jax's toy, and she says it doesn't feel that way. Being made to feel like a toy is not the result of mild bullying. It's the result of abuse, exploitation, coercive control. She's been made to feel like she isn't her own person. All that said, what I'm certainly not saying here is that Jax literally couldn't have been worse to her, because there's obviously levels, but the fact he could have been worse doesn't make what he did any less vile. If anyone exhibited this behavior in real life, you'd surely have to be disgusted, right? And the thing is, the narrative wants you to and requires you to acknowledge this. Goose herself has made this clear. However, while he still is a bad person either way, that distinction between how bad and what he actually did and didn't do is still very meaningful. That is to say, if Jax did any of the shit we saw him do in his brain during episode 9, the show making him sympathetic would be pretty hard to swallow. So I believe it's extremely important to clarify, Jax didn't and wouldn't ever do any of that, and that's why the show doesn't write him off as wholly evil. As is the point I've been making with the entirety of this video, Jax has done some truly nasty shit to Gangle specifically. He's taken advantage of her through both mental and physical coercion, even calling her submissive and agreeable outright, and preying on that, which is indeed deplorable. But there is a clear line between that and, say, trying to solicit sex from someone during their lover's funeral, which is what we supposedly see him do inside one of his doors. Now, there's a lot of pushback to what we saw in those doors representing intrusive thoughts, because what makes intrusive thoughts intrusive is the fact the sufferer doesn't truly believe in them, and they would never act upon them, not even to a small degree. At that point, you'd simply call them thoughts, not intrusive in any way. These also encompass false beliefs, such as cruel thoughts about others, which, to be very clear, are also unwanted and unfounded. So, seeing as we've seen him treat Gangle in all the aforementioned ways in the video, how can this thought possibly be intrusive when it's simply a natural progression of said ways? There are two important things to realize here. The first is that even bad people have intrusive thoughts, although there is absolutely no relation between being bad and suffering from them, because they don't represent your own morals and values. The other is that even if this behavior can look similar, they're totally different, distinct behaviors that shouldn't be conflated. After all, a person who abuses people in certain ways can still draw the moral line at, and fear, abusing people in other, worse ways. So, while you might be confused about what else Gangle blushing at him could mean, other than that he thinks she wants him sexually, that's a conflation and quite different to what he actually meant by saying that. While he very may well have deluded himself into believing she likes him as a friend, for reasons previously discussed, there's no reason to think there was innuendo there, and that same pretense of friendship also accounts for the couple of instances he felt comfortable bringing up a figurine thing, the only time anything sexual was ever brought up between them. Sans the maid dress vote, which was intended to ridicule him, not sexualize him. A message he got loud and clear. But if you're viewing what took place during the funeral sequence in any literal way in the first place, you're fundamentally misunderstanding their nature. All versions of the characters we see inside his mind are hyper-exaggerated caricatures, including himself. Jax doesn't truly see Pomni as someone who would say she's the only person who can fix him, or Zubul as a literal Looney Tunes-esque villain. Episodes 7 and 8 made it clear that he actually values these people a great deal. I mean, he clearly wasn't trying to get the key for himself, even if he ended up selfishly sabotaging his efforts in the the end, and he quite clearly liked the fact the others didn't want to leave him behind. And then you have the three Jaxes themselves. They are each based on a real coping mechanism that he has, sure, but more specifically, they represent Jax's fear of how he'll end up after particular circus members abstract. Jax worries that when Gangle dies, the version of him that pretends life is a cartoon will become completely out of touch with reality. He worries that when Ragatha dies, the version of him that takes his pain out on others will become a violent sociopath that would even hurt Pomni. These are cruel notions of both the others and himself that he clearly does not truly believe in and doesn't want to ever happen. After all, we're looking at glimpses into his mind, not the future or other universes, and this especially isn't what he wants to happen. I mean, why would he ever want to imagine the deaths of people he clearly cares about deep down? Every single aspect of the events behind these doors are intrusive. Now, you might have noticed I left a Jax out, and of course it's the one most relevant to this discussion. What exactly is the deal with what we see behind Zubal's death door? The Jax we see here is the one who uses irony to disguise his true feelings, and the fear at work is that when Zubal dies, Jax will be totally incapable of feeling or acting sincerely, treating everything with irreverence, and acting totally amorally to get a reaction, presumably just to feel something. When he makes passes at Gangle in this context, the whole point is that it's gross and uncomfortable. This version of him copes by being edgy and eliciting negative emotions. And to once more clarify, this is a much worse version of Jax that he's simply afraid of becoming, not who he actually is or would have been. As for why Gangle blushes, again, this is an unwanted, untrue, ugly depiction of her he doesn't want to believe in, and I have two guesses as to why this would even cross his mind. The first is that it's simply an extension of the figurine and maid dress thing, and that his intrusive thoughts may tell him she's a gross pervert, despite the fact he knows it's not true. What would be more telling about Jax, however, is if this intrusive thought stemmed from fearing he had given her Stockholm Syndrome from the abuse. Now, this isn't actually considered a real, backed-up diagnosis in the psychiatric world, like pop media would have you believe. However, this is Jax's brain and not reality. Knowing Jax has a heart and a moral code, however small, he may actually feel guilty for forcing this toxic relationship. And finally, keep in mind as well, this version of Gangle initially claims she hates him. This is not only a contradiction, remaining consistent with the nature of intrusive thoughts, but it also might be a fear of his, and that would remain consistent with Jax seeing a friend in her, deep down wanting her to like him. Unfortunately though, the ugly truth about how Gangle saw him in the end is a harrowing reflection of everything awful he's ever done to her, because when Jax abstracts, she's completely unable to cry for him, and more than being filled with hate like he feared, she simply didn't know how to feel. When she does eventually manage to cry after putting Jax to rest, so to speak, I have to wonder if she actually might have mourned the camaraderie they could have had Jax not tarnished it. This is all to say that Jax was bad, just not so bad he was incapable of change, and that he may have been capable of change, but that doesn't make his actions any more excusable than if he wasn't, or something. Thanks for watching.